Defense seems to be awesome. It's exactly how we all drew it up, right? Let's talk some Chiefs, you guys. Welcome to the Chief of the North on RGR Football. I am Seth Kaiser, the Chief of the North. Awesome to see all of you, as we do every week, every Tuesday, not every Thursday anymore, but every Tuesday. I'm going to talk about a few of the things that stood out to me in the most recent Chiefs game, some of the things that I'm working on the Chief of the North newsletter. There's a lot to go through, not a lot of time to go through it. So the two things that I'm going to be covering are the two things I've actually already written about this week on the Chief of the North newsletter. And the first was the defense, which performed lights out against the Jags. We'll talk about that shortly. And complementary pass rush, why it matters so much. It was a favorite topic of mine last year. And I think this year it might actually be like my theme because I think it's going to be really important. The other thing is talking about the offense. I just dropped an article. I think that's the term the kids are using these days on how the Chiefs cannot seem to get out of their own way with self-inflicted errors and why that's both good and bad news. We're going to talk about both of those things. But first, a few mailbag questions in the comment section, which, as I say to you guys every week, put any questions you have in the comment section below, not on the side thing, because that's just too much for me to go through. Put some question marks in front of it. I'll try to get to them during the season. We obviously have a lot of film to talk about and important things like that. So I, probably won't be tweeting about it unless we get like a bye week or something. But if you put your questions below, I will try to get to each and every one of them, unless some of them are, for example, asking me when I look at last week's, asking me to explain something from like a biblical point of view. Probably won't do that on Ryan's channel, but maybe I'll answer in the comment section. So anyway, put it down there in the comment section, put a question mark before it, and I will always try to get to every single one of them. And so we just got a couple here. One of them from Main Street Communications, after talking about Ronald Jones being suspended for using PEDs. Have you ever used performance-enhancing drugs to raise your game? And if so, what would happen if you were caught? I don't know what performance-enhancing drugs would be in my field. Probably like amphetamines. Not methamphetamine, but amphetamines to, kind of zero in the focus and give you more energy. I have not, but I'd consider it. I have a lot of kids and a lot of jobs. But doing that without prescription is a felony and I'd lose everything. So on second thought, maybe I won't. The Chiefs related question was, do I want to see Justin Ross get more targets? Do you think Reed will give him a chance to shine? I think it's pretty clear that Ross is at the bottom of the food chain at this point. I do think if Richie James continues to do very little with his snaps, I think you're going to keep seeing the younger guys get more and more chances. But really, Justin Watson's actually done a fair amount with his chances in terms of being where he's supposed to be and catching the ball. And so that's tough. MVS is going to get his looks, of course. And then from Kadarius Toney has his specific role, which means you don't really have that niche role because Tony's taking up a lot of those snaps. And then, Sky Moore's got his role. He performed a little bit better this last Sunday. I talked about him last week. I do still have some concerns about his ability to create separation on his own, but we'll see. I still have high hopes for Sky Moore. I just want to see him look a little bit different on film than he's looked previously in terms of harnessing some of his athletic gifts, especially his really killer releases off the line. That's a weapon. Now we need to see him take it to the next level on it. But Rashee Rice seems to be ahead of Ross in the pecking order in terms of who's going to keep getting chances. And so I think you'll see Ross probably have a game or two where maybe things go up for him a little bit, but there's just a lot of guys ahead of him in the pecking order. Do I think he will get a chance before the year ends? I do. But I just think a lot of it depends on how the guys in front of him do. And that's Andy Reid. That's the way it's always been with his receivers. But I see Rashee Rice's role growing significantly before I see Justin Ross's, at least based on what we've seen so far. It's always subject to change, of course. Dan Thompson asked if anyone knows if CJ's contract says anything about the franchise tag next year. No, it doesn't. They can still franchise tag him. It'll be pretty expensive, but that's another L that his team kind of took there. I did have someone ask related to Jones. Do you think Chris Jones ruined his reputation with Chiefs Kingdom? No, I don't. And do you think Kadarius Toney 19 will have himself a day against the Jags? Well, now we're back. He did some really good things, so we'll start in reverse here. Tony demonstrated that even if his role doesn't grow beyond being kind of more of a niche player, he's so explosive and so dynamic with the ball in his hands that it's kind of like I could see his role being like a juiced up version of McCole Hardman. And there's value in that, a lot of value in that, frankly. Um, and so now Hardman had more straightaway speed, which made him maybe a better shot at creating like a 70-yard gain. But Tony is significantly better at creating something from nothing in terms of or maximizing yardage, given his ability to move in space, his ability to shake tacklers, and his ability to really, I mean, he fights for yardage like crazy. He's not a tiny guy. And so I think with Tony, that's what we're seeing is even if his role never grows beyond what it currently is, and I think it will keep growing. I don't know if it's ever going to grow into like a full-time taking 90% of the snaps receiver. I guess we'll see. That's going to depend a lot on up here, not just what he can do physically. So even if it doesn't, though, and it's like a juiced up McCole Hardman, that's well worth the price the Chiefs paid for him. So I was really happy to see him get the ball in his hands. He did have that fumble late, so you're going to have to continue to develop on that. But you see the value of creating something from nothing, or creating more from a little, and it works out really well. It adds some juice to the offense. With regards to Chris Jones, I think people have made up their minds on that, or they haven't. I personally think that he's following the advice of representation. That is, in my opinion, perhaps poor. That said, I don't think he's wrong that he's one of the best 3 or 4 defensive players alive and looking for a contract that does go above and beyond, the Quentin Williams of the world, et cetera, because he's better than they are. So I get it. I like the 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I've taken part in negotiations at my work. That's really all this is. It's all part of the CBA. It's all part of the process of the business side of football. And I think because we romanticize football, and we should, because football is awesome, but I think that's what makes it so hard when the business part that the owners and the players, I assure you, are always very coherent of. I think when you see that bleed into what we see, that's a bummer. And we saw a little more of that with Patrick Mahomes getting a raise. I mean, a lot of people utilize Mahomes' contract as a reason to bash Jones, saying, well, look at Mahomes, and well, now Mahomes is getting more. Now, he still could do more. He always could do more. And I think part of it was he's working with the team to free up just a little bit of cap space this year. It's like $2.5 million. But it's worth noting, even Patrick Mahomes understands the business side of this. All right. Those are the mailbag questions we have. I appreciate them as ever. I always love answering questions. Put any questions you got below there. But let's talk about what we're writing about on the Chief of the North newsletter this week. The first thing I wrote about, because I always try to start with something fun after a win, was the dominance of the defense against a really very good Jacksonville Jaguars offense that has a lot of weapons. I am going to be trying to write on the secondary later this week, perhaps focusing exclusively on Trent McDuffie, trying to figure out whether to focus on the entire secondary or just Trent. We'll kind of see what we decide to do. Obviously, Chris Jones was the biggest storyline of the day. He came in and was completely dominant. Just unbelievable. It's difficult to describe how good he was throughout the day. And this was one of my favorite snaps of the day, just on a side note. When it comes back, watch George Karlaftis here. He has the protection slide his way, and he still is able to spin out of it, provide a little bit of pressure at the end of the snap, force Lawrence to hurry the throw, and know that he's got absolutely no more time to hold on to it on 4th and 12. So we're gonna talk here, and I want to make sure that the screen holds still about complementary pass rush. This is something I talked about a lot last year. But I want to talk about more this year because it becomes so important. I really want people to understand certain things that when you do, it really actually raises your level of enjoyment of the game because you see those things play out in real time. One of the things that happens when you've got a position or a position group that has multiple guys out on the field at once. So let's say like defensive lineman, right? You got 4 guys out there. When you slide a great player into that top spot, right? The only thing, it's not just that you get an improvement in that top spot. What that does is it bumps that number 1 guy down to number 2, that number 2 guy down to number 3 guy down to number 4. And it varies the roles. The same is true of cornerback. The same can be true in terms of helping schematically with offensive line. Same is definitely true with wide receiver. And that's why when you add in a superstar like Chris Jones, it's not just about getting a superstar. It is about that in part, but it's also that he changes the role of everyone around him. And that allows them to be in a better position to succeed. One of the ways that he changes their role is that if you go back and you look at the tape against the Lions in week one, Mike Dana and Tershawn Wharton, at times George Karlaftis when he slid inside, they often had protection sliding their way. And what all that means, generally speaking, when is protection sliding is depending on where the defensive tackle is aligned, who's the center helping with. It's mostly that simple. Mostly. Not entirely, but it's enough to get you by 80% of the time, maybe a little more. And so the primary threat is where pass protection is generally going to slide. And, that's one reason why on the edge it can be more difficult, because it's tough to slide the right guard to the edge, because if they go around the corner, you're wasting a blocker, right? That's why, running backs chip, tight ends help, that sort of stuff. You do other things to try to help with protection. But when you've got guys that aren't necessarily like primary guys who are meant to beat double teams, who are used to taking them on constantly, when protection slides their way, their performance is going to be a lot more muted. Whereas when like a Karlaftis, or although he just beat a double team, a slow win, but a win nonetheless, on that last snap we looked at, where those guys benefit is facing single blockers, because the pass protection is worried about Chris Jones. And that's part one of complementary pass rush, okay? Part two of complementary pass rush is a numbers game, okay? And it's a different kind of numbers game. So the first complementary pass rush is how guys complement one another in forcing teams to schematically adjust, okay? You got Chris Jones here. You've got the protection sliding near him. And then other guys can take advantage of one-on-one matchups. Everyone understands this. It's also can be complementary in the fact that if you need to keep in a tight end or a running back to pass protect, helps the secondary lock things down longer. And then the pass rush has a little more time to get home. That's another form of complementary pass rush. The final one that I think it's underlooked is this numbers game. What I mean by numbers is that, generally speaking, the very best players in the league, they win on like a quarter of their pass rush snaps. So what that means, though, is that, 70 to 75% of the time, they're not winning outside of, some outlier games, or outlier, excuse me. And I hear Briscoe laughing somewhere in my head. So what they do in those moments, the problem that teams have, if you've got one great pass rusher, let's say you've got a pass rusher that wins a third of his snaps, an unbelievable pass rusher, that still means 2/3 of the time he's not winning. And that's just the nature of the beast in the NFL. And so what happens on those other 2/3 of snaps? You need someone who can win on those snaps. And then ideally, if you've got, two guys that win at a 15% rate, and maybe one other guy that wins at like a 20% rate, like a pretty high rate, like maybe like a Charles Omenihu type. Then the idea is on like half the snaps, there's some kind of pressure, right? Because you stack that on top of each other. The other part of that, the numbers game of complementary pass rush, is a numbers game in a different way. And that's what Trevor Lawrence learned about here. So when you've got Chris Jones winning quickly around the edge here, you notice Lawrence tries to step up. So each time you watch this, watch a different guy. First, you watch Chris Jones. Great snap, creates pressure. Now let's watch George Karlaftis. Nice snap, sheds that center when the right guard, after trying to help for a minute, and he thinks Karlaftis is going to the other gap. So then he goes to try to help with Jones, but Jones is going to the edge. So he's just what he's doing here, he provides a little bit of late help that in theory would help him push Chris Jones wide of the pocket. So there's some use there, even if they go wide, but it's just difficult, as you can see there, when a guy has Jones's power bend. I mean, who bends like that at his size? But anyway, and bounce through contact. It's freakish. So in the meantime, again, so you start with Jones. He does something incredible. Karlaftis wins his snap here. And then you look here, Mike Dana also, you see how he gets depth, then tosses. Really nice snap on his end. Felix, who I really like, has shown some stuff. He doesn't do much on this snap, but that's the numbers game, right? Not everyone's going to win on any given snap, but on some snaps, when multiple guys win, that's where you end up in a situation where the quarterback has nowhere to go. And that's how pressures turn into hits and hits turn into sacks. It's a numbers game with complementary pass rush. It's how I phrased it here. It's the sum of the parts, not just one guy, that makes it a sack and closes out the drive in this case. And that's what you really want to see. And so I wrote about that on the Chief of the North newsletter. You should really check that out, because it's so important to know what like how all that complementary pass rush really works together, and how it allows for much more consistent pressure and much more effective pressure. You want your pressure to be consistent, you want it to be effective. Complementary pass rush allows for both. So that's what I wrote about there. You can check that on the Chief of the North newsletter. What dropped today, and is a lot less fun to talk about, is self-inflicted, the 2023 edition. We are back, baby, with Chiefs football, with the offense being the only thing that can stop the offense. So here's what I'll say, because we're running low on time. I went back and I charted every snap by the offense. And I'm going to do the usual Patrick Mahomes film review. That'll probably drop on Saturday. Here's what I found, because I wanted to try to decide, what's my panic meter after 2 mediocre showings by the offense. In week 1, we had all those drops, right? It was really rough, but it was really obvious what the problem is. This time, things were a little more complicated, but the general problem was the same. The Jags never really stopped the Chiefs much. They had some good snaps here and there, but overall, they didn't really stop the Chiefs on their drives. What happened here was more like this stuff on this 3rd and 6, where Justin Watson and Patrick Mahomes, they connect. Look at this pocket. That is beautiful stuff. They connect. Watson has long enough to come open here. And that's one of the advantages to pass protection lasting for a while. Eventually, someone moves the wrong way. They follow the quarterback's eyes too far. They're not sure where exactly Watson is headed. He does a nice job getting to the blind spot of the defender, finding the open zone. Shout out to Justin Watson. And he converts. But then, unshout out to Justin Watson, he fumbles the ball. This right here is an early drive that should be 1st and 10 from the opponent's 47, 48-yard line. Instead, the Chiefs are giving possession back here. And way too often, that's what we found. Or that's what I found upon looking at things. Obviously, everyone knows one thing that happened on the very first drive, where Marquez Valdez-Scantling gets open. He's beyond the sticks. And then he pulls what I like to call a DeMarcus Robinson. That's what every Chiefs fan calls it. Decides to jump backwards to try to gain yak, and he ends up being behind the line. Chiefs don't convert on 3rd and 1. We can talk about play calling on 3rd and 1. That kind of shifted a little in the second half. And I would just note that some of those sprint outs on 3rd and 4th and short, when the Chiefs were converting them like 90% of the time, everyone loved them. So that's just something to keep in mind there. But I'm sure just like you guys, was grateful to see Reed kind of doing a little bit more power football in some of those short yardage situations in the second half. We'll see what happens in the future moving forward. So what I did is I just looked at every drive, and I tried to determine how many drives the Chiefs killed on their own. And what I found is on the Chiefs' first 5 drives, they killed 3 of them directly. Richie James muffs a punt. You've got the fumble by Watson. You've got an interception by Mahomes, which, by the way, it was underthrown. Even Mahomes isn't perfect. It wasn't a bad throw necessarily, but it was underthrown just enough that I wouldn't call it an inaccurate pass, but it gave the safety an opportunity to make a great play, and he did. So that's kind of a half and half one there, right? The safety made a great play, but had the ball been a couple yards deeper to where Watson's stretching out for it rather than slowing and waiting for it at the hip, I don't know if Cisco's able to pick that ball off. So those are things that they did to themselves. They also cost themselves 2 valuable first downs during that time. It was a lot. And so the long and short of it is there was a drive before and after halftime where the Chiefs, in under 4 minutes both times, marched down the field, scored a touchdown. Those were the drives they didn't shoot themselves in the foot. There really isn't, when you go back and watch, you had the drive that was filled with a couple of Juwan Taylor penalties. You had the drive, like the full start drive with Taylor and as well as Joe Thuney. Well, Travis Kelce, and this is one that I'll show as well here. Travis Kelce had a snap that you don't usually see from him. Here's Kelce. You can tell, if you've been watching him the last 2 years, you can tell he's at less than 100% based on his movement here, especially where you see this quick cut out and then up the field. It's just more labored than it normally is. And as he gets to the end of the route, he's trying to get to this corner. He just doesn't have quite as much explosion as he normally does. Mahomes puts it where he normally would, and Kelce is just a foot short of where he normally would be. As it was, he still got his hands on it, could have caught it, would have been a really tough catch, but he could have. But being a foot short changes everything there. And that, again, it's a self-inflicted wound, more of an execution issue than anything else. There's good news, bad news time. And again, you can read, there's a bunch of other snaps that I talked about there on the Chief of the North newsletter. Go ahead, check it out, subscribe, make sure to utilize the coupon, $12 a year forever, etc. It's a good news, bad news thing. The bad news is the self-inflicted stuff that really plagued them in 2021. So for those because the next question I get from most people is, well, is that because Eric Bieniemy's gone? I don't think so. They really struggled with it in 2021. And that was with Tyreek Hill too, where throughout the season, there were 4 different games where I wrote about this same phenomenon. And then the 5th came in the AFC Championship game, where the Chiefs would never really stop. They just shot themselves in the foot repeatedly. So it was a big problem in 2021. In 2022, there was 1 or 2 games where it was like that, but it was a lot less so, and they cleaned a lot of it up. How this season goes for the offense, the short story is they're going to clean it up to an extent and have a good offense. That's the good news. They've cleaned this up before. It's all self-inflicted stuff. This is stuff that they know how to fix. Kelsey getting healthy will help, but like the basic setup of the offense is working, at least against these first 2 teams. They just keep doing ridiculous things that aren't necessarily sustainable in terms of doing bad things. Because Reed will start benching guys. That'll 100% happen if like the drops, the fumbles, that kind of stuff continues. So that's the good news. It is fixable, very fixable, without really doing anything. It's not this. People want to talk right now about the personnel issues at receiver. And I get it to an extent. You know, I joke around about Mike Evans or whatever, you know, get Kyle Pitts out of Atlanta, whatever, right? There are some personnel issues there, but not to the extent that they should be damaging the offense as much as they are. And so it's a more fixable thing than some huge schematic or personnel based deficiency. The bad news is this is something they've struggled with before, and it did cost them in 2021. Ultimately, they cost themselves a Super Bowl berth. And so how this Chiefs season will go is going to depend in part, especially with the defense that's looking really strong right now. It's going to depend in part on the offense's ability to get out of its own way. And if they can do that, you will see them right back to that top 5 offensive production, the way they move the ball. So we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, I've gone over my time, which I always do, so I don't know why I keep apologizing for it. Appreciate you guys all watching. Hopefully you found this somewhat illuminating. I enjoy this. Hopefully you do too. Make sure to hit like, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. We appreciate you a great deal. Shout out to Ryan, man. I miss appearing with Ryan. I bet he misses me too. He's a great dude. All right, that's what I've got for you guys. Thanks for watching. And just keep in mind, it is a great week to be a Chiefs fan.